Why is it that the day the empath stops caring, you truly awaken? Welcome to our channel. I can confidently say that this is something you will encounter at least once in your life. It is a pattern, a psychological reality that almost everyone goes through at some point. The moment when an empath stops caring about you, and strangely enough, that moment is often the same moment you begin to realize something uncomfortable, that in the end, the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Even the most trusted person in your life can only go so far. So what exactly is happening here? Why does this paradox exist? And what really changes inside a person when they finally wake up to this truth? Most importantly, what kind of state do you reach when you no longer overthink, no longer overgive, and no longer overcare? Let's find out. There comes a moment in every empath's life when something inside them goes completely silent. Not broken, not angry, just done. Carl Jung discovered this wasn't depression or emotional exhaustion. He called it the final stage of spiritual awakening. And it terrifies everyone who witnesses it because when an empath stops caring, they don't become cruel, they become untouchable, and that changes everything. Jung spent decades studying patients who reach this state. What he found challenges everything we think we know about empathy, spirituality, and personal transformation. The moment the empath stops caring isn't the end of their journey. It's the beginning of something far more powerful. Before we understand why empaths stop caring, we need to see what brings them to that edge. Jung documented a consistent pattern across his most music-sensitive patients. These weren't people who occasionally felt things deeply. These were individuals whose entire nervous system functioned as an emotional receiver for everyone around them. They walked into rooms and immediately absorbed the psychological atmosphere. Family dinners left them exhausted from managing everyone's unspoken tensions. Friendships drained them because they carried both sides of every conflict. Romantic relationships nearly destroyed them because they felt their partner's pain more intensely than their partner did. Jung called these individuals the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. They didn't just empathize with suffering. They absorbed it, processed it, and somehow transmuted it so others could function. Parents dumped their anxiety onto them. Siblings used them as free therapists. Partners treated them like emotional support, animals who existed solely to manage their moods. And here's what made Jung's observations so disturbing. These empaths never complained. They accepted this role as their purpose. They believed their sensitivity was meant to serve others, that their gift obligated them to sacrifice their own peace for everyone else's comfort. They wore their exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof they were good people who cared enough to suffer. The cultural conditioning ran deep. From childhood, they had been praised for being understanding, for making others feel better, for keeping the peace. Every time they suppressed their own needs to accommodate someone else, they received validation. Every time they absorbed someone's anger to prevent conflict, they were told they were mature beyond their years. This positive reinforcement created a pattern of self-abandonment that felt like virtue. But Jung noticed something the empaths themselves couldn't see yet. Behind their compassionate facade, their psyche was keeping records. Every manipulation, every betrayal, every moment someone took advantage of their kindness. The empath's unconscious mind wasn't just absorbing these experiences randomly. It was cataloging patterns with surgical precision. Consider someone who spent 15 years managing their family's dysfunction. They knew exactly which words would trigger their mother's guilt trips. They understood the precise emotional sequence their father used to avoid accountability. They could predict when siblings would manufacture crises to regain attention. They had mapped every psychological game, being played around them with the accuracy of a sargrapher charting familiar territory. But here's what Jung found most remarkable. Despite possessing this knowledge, they never weaponized it. Not once. They just kept absorbing, kept caring, kept giving, until something fundamental inside of them began to crack. Their consciousness had become a detailed archive of everyone else's patterns, while their own needs remained buried under layers of service and sacrifice. This created what Jung identified as a dangerous psychological split. On the surface, the empath appeared functional, even thriving in their role as caretaker. But beneath that surface, resentment was accumulating like pressure in a sealed container. Not conscious resentment that could be expressed and released, but unconscious resentment that poisoned their sense of self. The breaking point always came from betrayal, not simple disappointment or minor conflict. Profound betrayal from someone the empath had protected, defended, and loved unconditionally. Jung documented this trigger point across dozens of cases, identifying it as the catalyst that forces shadow integration. The story repeats itself with disturbing consistency. Someone discovers their partner's infidelity after years of managing that partner's emotional instability, depression, and anxiety. The adult child learns their parent has been speaking cruel about them, behind their back after decades of serving as the family's emotional glue. The friend discovers devastating lies after years of carrying secrets and providing unconditional support. What made these betrayals so destructive wasn't just the act itself. It was the empath's sudden recognition that they had seen the warning signs all along and ignored them. Their intuition had screamed the truth for months or years, but they had silenced it. They had chosen to believe the best in someone who was showing them exactly who they were. They had betrayed themselves to maintain their fantasy of who others could become. This self-betrayal cut deeper than the external betrayal. The empath realized they had participated in their own exploitation. They had ignored their inner voice, dismissed their gut feelings, and overridden their boundaries to maintain relationships that were destroying them. The anger they felt wasn't music, just toward the betrayer. It was toward themselves for allowing it to continue long after they knew better. That realization shattered something fundamental, not their heart, their illusions. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. The empath had been projecting goodness, potential, and innocence onto people who didn't possess these qualities. They had been seeing not who people were, but who the empath desperately wanted them to be. When those projections finally collapsed, the empath didn't cry or rage or fall apart the way everyone expected. Instead, something far more terrifying happened. They became quiet, unnaturally calm. Their eyes changed, not with tears, but with clarity. The fog lifted, and for the first time in their lives, they saw reality without the distortion of their desperate hope. If this message resonates with you, like the video and comment, "I am done." Jung described this moment as one of the most chilling psychological transformations he had ever witnessed in his clinical practice. The empath stopped performing emotional labor. They stopped managing other people's feelings. They stopped explaining, justifying, or apologizing for their own needs. They didn't announce these changes. They didn't make dramatic declarations. They simply stopped participating in the dysfunctional systems they had been holding together. Family members who had relied on them to mediate conflicts suddenly found themselves having to face each other directly. Partners who had used them as emotional crutches discovered they could no longer provoke the familiar reactions. Friends who had treated them as free therapists encountered boundaries where endless availability used to be. The empath had withdrawn their energy from the emotional economy that depended on their exploitation. And here's what made this transformation music so disturbing to others. The empath wasn't angry. Anger would have been familiar, manageable, something others could work with or manipulate. They knew how to handle the empath's anger because it always dissolved back into forgiveness and resumed caretaking. This wasn't anger. This was complete indifference to the emotional games that used to control them. People around them tried everything to provoke the old responses. They manufactured crises. They played the victim. They guilt, tripped, and manipulated, but nothing worked. The empath had unplugged from the emotional matrix that once controlled them. They watched these attempts with detached curiosity. Like a scientist observing predictable behavior in a laboratory setting, Jung identified this as the integration of the shadow. Every empath carries a shadow self they've been taught to deny. The part of them that's selfish, that prioritizes their own needs, that refuses to save people from themselves. Society had convinced them this shadow was evil, something to be suppressed and overcome. Religious teachings told them selflessness was virtue. Cultural narratives praised endless sacrifice. Family systems rewarded their self-abandonment. But Jung understood that this shadow wasn't evil. It was the empath's survival instinct. It was their psychological immune system trying to protect them from being consumed by others' dysfunction. When the betrayal finally forced them to integrate this shadow, they didn't become cruel. They became complete. The selfish shadow merged with the compassionate light, creating something society had never prepared for. An empath who could feel everything, but chose consciously where to direct that feeling. An empath who saw through manipulation, but no longer felt obligated to pretend they didn't. An empath who loved deeply, but only those who had earned access to that music, love through reciprocity and respect. This is what Jung meant by the final stage of spiritual awakening. Not transcending the ego, but integrating all aspects of the self into conscious choice. The empath had spent their entire life caring for others at their own expense. Now they were learning to care for themselves with the same intensity they had once given away so freely. This wasn't selfishness. This was self-preservation. Finally, being honored as sacred. The shift in energy was immediate and unmistakable. Where the empath had at once radiated warmth indiscriminately, they now emanated something more selective. Not coldness, but consciousness. They no longer leaked emotional energy to anyone who demanded it. Their presence felt different, grounded, impenetrable. They had become what Jung called selectively empathetic. This selectivity looked like boundaries to some and cruelty to others. The empath stopped responding to manipulative texts immediately. They let phone calls from energy vampires go to voicemail. They said no to requests that once would have guilted them into automatic yes. They stopped attending family gatherings that left them emotionally devastated. They ended friendships that had always been one-sided. They walked away from people they had spent years trying to save. But here's what outside observers missed. The empath hadn't stopped caring about these people. They had stopped caring about maintaining relationships that required them to betray themselves. They had stopped caring about being liked by people who had never truly valued them. They had stopped caring about keeping peace in systems that built on their silent suffering. The empath finally understood a truth that Jung had tried to teach for decades. You can't love others well until you love yourself first. Not the shallow self-love of narcissism, but the deep self-respect that refuses to participate in your own destruction. This was the foundation that had always been missing from their relationships. In the workplace, this transformation manifested as professional boundaries that shocked colleagues. The individual who used to absorb everyone's stress and manage office drama simply stopped. They completed their work excellently, but no longer took on others' responsibilities. They attended meetings, but no longer smoothed over conflicts that weren't theirs to fix. They remained pleasant, but impenetrable to the emotional manipulations that used to derail them. Managers who had relied on them to do three people's job suddenly faced someone who worked their contracted hours and nothing more. Co-workers who had dumped their problems on them encountered polite redirection, music, to appropriate resources. The office dynamic shifted because the empath had removed themselves from the role of universal emotional dumping ground. In family systems, the changes were even more dramatic. The empath, who had always hosted holidays, mediated feuds, and absorbed everyone's dysfunction, stopped performing these functions, not with announcements or confrontations. They simply became unavailable for the roles they had been unconsciously assigned since childhood. Parents who had treated them as emotional support discovered boundaries. Siblings who had exploited their generosity encountered limits. Extended family who had taken them for granted faced a version of the empath they didn't recognize. Someone who smiled politely, but didn't engage with drama. Someone who loved from a distance rather than drowning in proximity. Someone who said, "That doesn't work for me," without explanation or apology. The family often responded with shock and accusations. "How could you be so selfish? What happened to you? You've changed." And the empath would simply nod, because yes, they had changed. They had finally stopped setting themselves on fire to keep others warm. The most profound shift happened in romantic relationships. Empaths who reached this stage either transformed their partnerships completely or ended them without the usual agony. Partners who had relied on the empath's endless forgiveness suddenly faced accountability. Behaviors that had been tolerated for years were no longer acceptable. The empath stopped explaining why certain things hurt them. They simply removed themselves from situations that violated their peace. Some partners rose to meet this new version of the empath. They recognized they had been taking advantage of someone extraordinary and chose to become worthy of that person. These relationships evolved into something healthier, more balanced, built on mutual respect rather than one-sided emotional labor. Other partners couldn't adapt. They missed the version of the empath who absorbed their dysfunction, managed their emotions, and asked for nothing in return. When they tried old manipulation tactics and found them ineffective, they often left, searching for a new empath to exploit, and the awakened empath let them go without the usual pain. Recognizing the departure as protection rather than loss, Jung observed that this indifference caused panic in the empath's social circle, not because the empath became mean or vindictive, but because their absence revealed how much dysfunction they had been concealing. Family systems that seemed functional fell apart without the empath holding them together. Friendships that seemed deep revealed themselves as parasitic. Workplaces that ran smoothly descended into chaos without the empath's invisible emotional labor. The people who had benefited from the empath's unconscious servitude suddenly understood what they had lost. But by then, the empath had moved beyond caring about their realization. This wasn't revenge. This was sovereignty. The empath had finally learned that their gift wasn't meant to be given to everyone, but protected and shared only with those who valued it. Jung called this state psychologically invincible, not because nothing could hurt the empath anymore, but because they had integrated their capacity to feel everything with the wisdom to choose their responses. They could still sense others' pain, read emotional atmospheres, and perceive unspoken truths. But these perceptions no longer controlled them. They had become the conscious director of their own empathy, rather than its unconscious slave. This is where Jung's research revealed something beautiful and terrifying. These awakened empaths developed abilities that made them nearly impossible to manipulate. They could identify narcissists within minutes of meeting them. They recognized love bombing, future faking, and gaslighting before these tactics could take root. They sensed inauthentic energy and simply didn't engage with it. Their integrated consciousness functioned as an early warning system that protected them automatically, but they didn't use these abilities destructively. They could have weaponized their psychological insight to destroy everyone who had hurt them. They possessed intimate knowledge of others, vulnerabilities, fears, and weaknesses. Yet, they chose not to retaliate. They simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved forward. This restraint came not from weakness, but from genuine disinterest in revenge. Jung was disturbed by this restraint, not because he wanted them to seek revenge, but because he recognized how much power they were choosing not to abuse. These empaths had become psychological masters who understood human nature at levels most people never reach. They could manipulate, control, and devastate if they chose. Instead, they used their power to protect their peace and help others who were ready to grow. This selective application of their gifts created what Jung called the empath's mirror effect. Their mere presence made inauthentic people uncomfortable. Manipulators felt exposed without the empath saying a word. Energy vampires sensed they couldn't feed and moved on to easier targets. Meanwhile, authentic people felt safe around the awakened empath for the first time, recognizing someone who saw them clearly without judgment. The awakened empath became a living filter. Their consciousness automatically repelled dysfunction and attracted growth. They didn't have to actively vet people anymore. Their integrated presence did it naturally. Those who couldn't handle their clarity removed themselves. Those who valued authentic connection moved closer. The empath social circle transformed completely without deliberative effort. Jung documented how these empaths rebuilt their lives on completely different foundations. They chose careers that honored their sensitivity rather than exploited it. Some became therapists who could hold space without absorbing clients' pain. Others became artists who channeled their perception into creation. Many found work that allowed solitude and autonomy, protecting their energy from constant depletion. They created friend groups based on reciprocity rather than rescue dynamics. Every relationship became a conscious choice rather than an unconscious obligation. They entered romantic relationships as whole people rather than as fixers or saviors. They chose partners who valued their peace as much as they did, who understood that love doesn't require suffering. Everything changed because they had finally learned to value themselves as much as they valued others. Their homes became sanctuaries instead of open hospitals. Their time became precious instead of infinitely available. Their energy became sacred instead of carelessly distributed. They understood that protecting their inner peace wasn't selfish. It was necessary for their survival and essential for their contribution to the world. This is the moment, stopping caring about others' dysfunction became the moment of finally caring for their own soul. The ultimate act of self-love, not narcissism or selfishness, but the recognition that their empathy was a gift that deserved protection, boundaries, and conscious direction. They had learned what Jung tried to teach all his patients. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and martyrdom serves no one. Jung understood this transformation as the birth of a sovereign individual, someone who had moved through unconscious empathy, through betrayal and breaking, through shadow integration, and emerged as a conscious chooser of their own reality. They no longer reacted to others' emotional demands. They responded from a place of integrated wholeness. Every action became intentional rather than reactive. The empath who stops caring hasn't lost their humanity. They found their power. They haven't become cold. They've become conscious. They haven't stopped loving. They've learned to love themselves with the same fierce devotion they once gave away, indiscriminately. This evolution represents the highest form of psychological development Jung identified in his work. This is why Jung called it the final stage of spiritual awakening. Not because there's nowhere left to grow, but because the empath has finally integrated the fundamental lesson. Their sensitivity is sacred, their energy is valuable, their peace is non-negotiable, and anyone who cannot respect these truths has no place in their life. This isn't cruelty, this is clarity. The awakened empath becomes what society desperately needs but rarely deserves. Someone who can feel deeply without losing themselves. Someone who can love powerfully without enabling dysfunction. Someone who can see clearly without becoming cynical. They are love with boundaries, compassion with wisdom, kindness with strength, empathy with sovereignty. This transformation isn't a loss, it's a victory. Not over others, but over the conditioning that taught empaths their worth came from how much they could sacrifice. The empath who stops caring about maintaining peace in toxic systems has started caring about cultivating peace in their own soul. They've rejected the false narrative that goodness requires suffering and that love demands self-abandonment. The moment the empath stops caring isn't at the end of their story. It's the beginning of their sovereignty. And that's exactly what the world needs more of. Not empaths who sacrifice themselves endlessly, but empaths who have learned to wield their gifts consciously, powerfully, and selectively. Welcome to your awakening. You've earned this transformation through every moment you suffered in silence. And now you're finally free. Now, I'd like to share a meaningful story with everyone. I am a 30-year-old man. My mother passed away when I was very young. My father left me in the care of my grandmother and aunts so that he could focus on building a new family. Eventually, he got what he wanted, a new wife and more children. In his eyes, there was only his beautiful new wife and his adorable kids. He completely forgot that I existed. He never visited me or asked about me. He never sent my grandmother a single penny to help raise me. My grandmother was heartbroken, resentful, and angry, but she had too much pride to ask my father for help. She raised and educated me on her own, with the support of my aunts. My father was very wealthy. He had a big house, luxury cars, and dressed elegantly. Growing up, I was always confused and curious about why I was treated that way. Then one day, news of my father's divorce spread everywhere. It turned out that he was incredibly stingy, cheap, and obsessive about money. He could spend freely on himself, but when it came to other people, even his own flesh and blood, he counted every penny. I later heard that his ex-wife married a Western man and took their 2 children overseas. Sometime later, I heard that my father had gotten married again. This time, people said, let's see how long this happiness lasts. Soon he had another child. From what I heard, he was happier than ever. The whole family looked perfect and complete. Then I became seriously ill. I was so sick that it seemed unlikely I would survive. We didn't have enough money for treatment, so my grandmother went to ask my father for help. His response was, with an illness like that, treatment probably won't make a difference. Who knows if he'll survive anyway? And if he lives longer, he'll only suffer more. Just take him home and let him die there. After saying that, he handed my grandmother 50 million VND and told her it was for my food, supplements, and funeral expenses when I died. He also told her not to come looking for him again. My grandmother was furious, but she accepted the money because we were struggling so much that every bit helped. A little over a week later, I heard that his family had built a new house and then gone on an overseas vacation for an entire week. I felt so sorry for my grandmother. She was so hurt and humiliated that she cried constantly. But my grandmother and aunts refused to give up on me. They fought desperately to keep me alive, doing everything they possibly could. Fortunately, fate was on my side. A group of Doctors Without Borders physicians helped me. They arranged for me to be taken overseas for treatment. They pulled me back from the gates of hell. The treatment was successful. Gradually, I recovered, regained my health, and returned to normal life. While I was hospitalized abroad, I was taught IT skills. After returning home, I found work in the IT field and started earning money to support my grandmother. Today, I may not be wealthy, but I have a stable career and a good income. I was able to buy a comfortable home and give my grandmother a better life. I do everything I can to support her emotionally and financially. The two of us, once alone in the world, have always loved and cared for each other. My grandmother hopes that one day I'll get married. Over the past 6 years, my father has gone bankrupt. He lost everything. Now he is struggling with illness, while supporting a young child and a third wife who enjoys spending money more than earning it. The man who once lived such a grand life has become a shadow of his former self. One day, he came to ask me for help. Ironically, when he arrived at my house, he only recognized my grandmother and my aunts. He had no idea who I was. For 27 years, he and I had never once met face to face. Later, after my grandmother explained who I was, he finally called me son. It was the first time in my life that I had ever heard that word from him. He asked me for money, a substantial amount to pay for medical treatment, support his wife and child, start a business, and rent a house that was, in his words, respectable enough. I gave him 100 million VND. Then I repeated the same words he had spoken to my grandmother many years ago. I also gave him an additional 50 million VND, considering it interest. I didn't want to owe him anything. I told him that I had repaid everything and that he should never come looking for me again. I had no obligations toward him whatsoever. He stood there crying, but to me, those were nothing more than crocodile tears. Many people would probably say that I am heartless and unfilial, but honestly, that was the kindest thing I could bring myself to do for him. He did not deserve anything more from me. That afternoon, I drove my grandmother shopping. We went out to eat, visited my mother's grave, and I also purchased a burial plot for my grandmother right beside my mother's. I took my grandmother and my aunts on vacations. I made a promise to myself that I would take care of my grandmother and aunts for the rest of their lives. The person I owe a lifelong debt of gratitude to is my grandmother, not him. Dear viewers, that was our channel's discussion on the topic. Why is it that the day the empath stops caring, you truly awaken? If you found this video helpful or meaningful, please consider subscribing to support the channel. If you'd like me to create more content about emotions, relationships, or other psychological topics, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I'll do my best to help you understand why you're feeling the way you do and what's really happening beneath the surface. For now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Thank you.